But yes, we are diving back into our series called A Tale of Two Kings. And A Tale of Two Kings is a dive into 1 Samuel. And so we're looking at the lives of Saul and David. And we've already starting to see the transition happening. These were the first two earthly kings of Israel. And we're seeing what can happen when false selves get lived out. We're seeing what insecurities, when not dealt with, happens when they're lived out. And so we're really looking at these two different personalities, drawing some contrast, but ultimately we're learning that there's only one king that's going to satisfy your soul, and it's King Jesus, right? And so last week, as we finished up the story of David and Goliath, we were really taking that story from a different lens. I don't want to tell you about how smooth the stones were. I didn't want to tell you how a slingshot was used. I wanted you to see what it looked like to be obedient to God even when the circumstances were not in your favor. Even when family could say things to you, even when somebody in higher position and authority says something to you, even when your enemy says something to you, and really so much about fear in our lives is surrounded around this idea of belief. Believe what you believe about God, believe what you believe about yourself, and believe about what you believe about your circumstances. And so all of that is important, right? How we see things, understand things, and believe things. And yet, we know as the story goes, David believed God to be big enough, powerful enough to take down the giant that was in the way. And in that, we see the giant go a-tumbling down. And as he does, one thing we did not cover last week was David approaches the giant. Do we have any hunters in the house? A few. And when you go hunting and you get your prey, you get your thing that you're going after, depending on what it is that you go and take down, you might approach that beast, if you will, with different levels of timidity. If I was approaching a white-tailed doe, I'm not overly worried if it's still alive. If I was approaching a bear, I'm going to be gun drawn, touching its face. Because if that thing moves, I'm pulling the trigger. What David ends up doing is he approaches the giant, the beast, and he pulls out his sword. Not David's sword, because right, he just had the slingshot. He pulls out Goliath's sword, chops off his head, and is going to take it back to Jerusalem. Now, real quick, he doesn't get back to Jerusalem for a couple of years. So what is he doing with his head in the meantime? It's like if you get that doe, or you get that buck, right? You get that thing stuffed, you place it in the house, it's your badge of honor, say, I did that. David more than likely had Goliath's head in his tent. For anybody that came in, I did that. Right? That was his 12-point buck, if you will. Right? So, interesting, but eventually, word is getting back about David's victory. All of Israel knows about this. They're writing songs about this moment, this feat of David. And as word's getting around, you can begin to imagine that people are probably looking at David in a certain light. I remember when I first felt called to the ministry, I began watching certain pastors preach. And I watched a wide variety of them. But I remember thinking, I really enjoyed some of these ministries. But I remember thinking, like, if I could just be like Francis Chan, right? If I could just have that passion of a Chan, or if I had the intellect of a John Piper, or I had the unapologeticness as a Matt Chandler, I figured if I could take all these pieces and form it into one preacher, then that's going to be a really dynamic preacher. And what it did was it began to allow me to try to impersonate those preachers. So much so that I would be getting ready for a message and I'd be in my room like yelling, and they'd be like, what in the earth is Tyler doing? Has he gone mad? But it was like I just wanted to be like these guys. And there's nothing wrong with seeing pastors or authors or people that you say, hey, they are faithfully committed to God's word. There's nothing wrong with seeing that, acknowledging that, saying, hey, being faithful is worth emulating. But if that becomes and starts getting cloudy and it begins to not just honoring faithfulness, but actually saying, hey, envy, jealousy, it can really start robbing you of real life, real joy. Because guess what? I don't have the whiny sound of a Francis Chan. This is the holy word of God, right? And I'm not as smart as John Piper. Just not. There's not a DR in front of my name, right? He's an intellectual individual. I'm not that. I'm intellectual, but not that level. Now, Chandler and I are pretty much twinsies. Kidding. And there's nothing wrong with having that writer or pastor that you've read or listened to that's impacted you. But if it gets to the place of envy and jealousy, that will lead to destruction. It does. Envy and jealousy, given an open door, will wreak havoc in one's life. And in our text this morning, what we're going to see is that after David gets back from killing this Philistine, Saul's going to be having a lot of introspection with him. He's going to be investigating him. He's going to, and through that investigation, what it's going to give birth to is envy and jealousy. And it's ultimately going to be his demise. But then we're going to see that Saul's son Jonathan becomes a devoted friend to David. Right? There's that idea that he's attracted to David's faithfulness. Right? Again, like I said, you can look at these people and you can say, hey, I see your faithfulness. And I desire to have that same level of faithfulness. I feel like I have that same level of faithfulness and committedness to God's word. And nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong to being drawn to people that you see as faithful. Right? You're going to see that in Jonathan. But it doesn't give birth to an envy or a rivalry, or he doesn't feel like he's competing with David. Yet Saul, on the other hand, will. Our big idea for this morning is this: your character will draw people of like faithfulness, not like-mindedness, like faithfulness, and repel those who are in stark opposition to you. And it's this idea that when Jesus says, if they hated me, they're going to hate you also. Right? When Jesus says that, he doesn't give you a license to go be a jerk and have people hate you. He's saying that, hey, if you're being faithful to me, if you're honoring me, you're loving the way that I've called you to love, and people hate you for it, don't be surprised because they did that to me too. That doesn't mean you get to be a jerk, right? And so, all the while, faithfulness to God also allows us to experience the covenant community of faith. Right? That when you profess faith in Jesus, it will inevitably bring people around you that see that faithfulness and say, hey, I desire to do life with you. I desire to go into the trenches with you to help push back darkness in the world and the places where we live, work, and play, right? There's this idea that you will draw people that are similar to you, right? They say that you're the sum total of your five closest friends. There's a level that's true. Right? If I don't know you, but I can know your friend group, I could determine a lot of things about you. Right? The people who you choose to do company with. And yet, while we have this covenant community of faith, we also have enemies. This faithfulness to God creates enemies. And for us, not enemies that we hate. Not enemies that we hate, enemies that we are called to love, to chase, to pursue. As Charles Spurgeon once said, he said, if sinners be damned, at least let them leap to hell over our dead bodies. And if they perish, let them perish with our arms wrapped about their knees, imploring them to say, if hell must be filled, let it be filled in the teeth of our exertions, and let no one go unwarned and unprayed for. You see, we do have an enemy, it is Satan. And he has one sole motivation. His sole motivation is to seek, kill, and destroy. The Bible tells us that he is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And while Satan's out there looking to devour people, those same people that he's looking to devour are the same people that we're called to go and pursue, to go and tell them about the good news about Jesus, to tell them the gospel. And so there's this race that's taking place, this battle going on. And yet, whether being obedient to God is easy or it's not, this is the call. Whether people love you or hate you, the call is still the same, to pursue and to love. Knowing all the while that people might not like you because of it. And that's okay. That's okay. I don't know if you needed a license to not be liked, but it's okay to not be liked. And the moment where everyone does like you, I do begin to wonder, what are you standing on? You know, what soil have you stood on that has now allowed you to find love from the world and the love from God? Jesus says that's not possible. That you will one will love you and one will hate you, right? Like it's not going to be both. And so as we approach our text this morning, 1 Samuel 18, I want to give you some context, because if we just jump right into 18, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. But as chapter 17 is concluding or finishing, this is how it finishes. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, and Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand, and said to Saul, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Question. Why is Saul asking about who David's father is? Why is he asking about who David's father is? Well, potentially, when the first time you see that question asked, my guess would be Saul's probably thinking, hey, Abner, whose boy is that? Because we're probably going to have to go and start getting the death notification ready. Right? We're probably going to have to go to whoever his dad's house is and say, hey, sorry, he was really faithful, had this big idea, this grand idea that God was going to come through for him, but yeah, Goliath did some work on him. Right? That could have been the thought process on why he was asking, whose son is that? But then, the second time, David's got Goliath's head in hand. Question for you, David. Who's your dad? Who was like this kindergarten cop with Arnold Schwarzenegger. We're going to play a little game called Who is Your Daddy and What Does He Do? Right? He wants to know, who is your daddy? Who is he? Why is Saul asking that question? It's investigative. It's investigative. If you look back and remember from 1 Samuel 15, as Samuel approaches Saul, this is what said. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and observed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me, that I may bow before the Lord. And Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And Samuel turned to go away. Saul seized the skirt of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours. who is better than you. And so in 1 Samuel 15, God had came to Saul and he says, hey, I want you to wipe out the Amalekites. Don't leave any remains. Well, Saul says, this cattle is probably worth some good money. It's probably worth could be a really good sacrifice to God. So I'll do that. And I'm not going to take out their king. You know, I'm trying to be PC. I'm going to try and hold order. And yet, God says, hey, you didn't listen. I gave you specific instructions, and so now your disobedience, I'm not going to have you be king. And so in that, he says, I'm going to give them another king. And so Samuel shows up, and he says, the Lord has torn the kingdom from you this day and has given it to the neighbor of yours who is better than you. You think those words stung a bit? You know, hearing, hey, you're not good enough. We're going to have somebody else do this that can do this better than you. You know, everything we know about Saul's false self is that he wants to be seen as powerful and mighty. He wants to be seen as the guy that can handle anything. Right? He wants to be rejoiced in. And now he's being told, hey, that neighbor of yours that we're going to give it to, he can do it better than you. I have to imagine that every turn after that moment, after he gets that messaging, he's looking at everybody and wondering, and he's just measuring them and wondering, could you be the next king? I'm sure those words haunted Saul. You know, to always be wondering, hey, is this somebody that I could trust? Is this somebody that I could have in a good position? Or is this somebody who's going to potentially be king? And so with that framework, let's pick up in our text, 1 Samuel 18. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, David, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor, and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And so as that conversation was wrapping up, we don't know exactly where Jonathan was, but close enough nearby to approach David after that conversation. And what he says, he's like, I've found somebody that's like me. Right? I've found somebody that I can truly connect with, that we have the same mindset, the same worldview. Right? He wasn't just necessarily looking at him and fawning over him because here was David, this champion, military, warlike figure. No, he sees faithfulness. Jonathan sees David's faithfulness, and he pursues him, and he says, hey, I want this connection. I want this friendship. Right? He saw David. He saw this guy that was willing to stand alone, a man who was willing to be an army of one, that when an entire nation pulled back from Goliath, David says, no, my faith in God is that who is this clown that would defy the armies of the living God? Like, he had this transcendent view of who God was, and he's like, hey, why would anybody shy back from this clown? Don't you know who's got our back? Don't you know who this war is really against? Goliath's going to lose. I've seen God show up in my life way too many times. Jonathan sees that. He says, this is one like me. Because look, if you remember back to 1 Samuel 14, verse 6, this is when Jonathan was going to battle with the Philistines at Geba. And it says this, Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised, that it may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. Like, right, when the Israelites had found themselves in hot water before, Jonathan was like, hey, my belief is that God can show up. And he doesn't need a big army. He can have a few people. No matter what it is, God can do this. And so he sees this like faithfulness in David. And look what our text says. It says that that Jonathan made a covenant with David. Now if you're church-going people, and you hear that word covenant, your mind is probably running to this idea of marriage, and you're not wrong in that, right? We use the word covenant to describe marriage. If you ever gone to a Christian wedding, they're saying, hey, today we're not making a contract, we're making a covenant. And covenants are not made because life is going to get really sweet and awesome. Right? You don't make that covenant in marriage. You don't stand across from your spouse and say, hey, if we get really rich and life goes really easy, I'll stay. No, we make those covenants because when life gets hard, when you get sick, when you go broke, I'm staying. Staying no matter how bad this gets. I'm willing to stay. And David here does this within friendship, within a brother, right? He makes this covenant, right? When we've kind of lost that art in 2023, like we don't see covenants outside of the covenant of marriage, but author of the Bible, you see plenty of covenants. God makes plenty of covenants with his people, and they're not sexual, right? And so why are we not these types of people that are making covenants with one another, with our faith community? And I know we live in 2023, and people brag about being non-committal, like commitment issues. When I did young adult ministry, we were going to do this dating series, and we called it Commitment Issues. I look back and I think, why in the earth did we do that? Because it's nothing to brag about. For the fact that so much of the Christian faith is surrounded by commitment towards God and commitment towards one another. Right? Real, tangible, like, hey, if this gets hard, we're not going anywhere. And it's not just that we have commitment issues, but we also live within cancel culture. Agreement is not required for fellowship. Agreement is not required for fellowship. And this idea that, hey, there's a lot of things in this world that we can have opinions about and thoughts about and we can take stances on. But in order for us to be a loving people, to display love, we're going to have to do that with people that don't necessarily agree with us. And you know what? If it's on their end and they say, hey, we want nothing to do with you because you believe in God and you believe in Jesus and you believe that archaic book and they make those kinds of statements and those kinds of, hey, we can live we live peaceably as long as it's up to us. That's the scripture. If people want nothing to do with you because you love Jesus, you can't do anything about that. But far be it from you to be the one to throw the wall up and say, I want nothing to do with you because you believe that. We're not those kinds of people. We're not. And so it's maddening to me when I see things on social media that people say, well, block me if you think that. It's like, and I get it. Social media friendship means absolutely nothing, right? But if that's the way we actually view our friendships, that they're so interchangeable that we can just lose people like this and like that because of disagreement, I think we have a very shallow understanding of biblical friendship. Because guess what? David's and Jonathan's covenant was going to get tested. Family dynamics were going to come into play. If you're not familiar with the story of Saul and David, Saul tries to kill David, and Jonathan, Saul's son. So you can imagine the dilemma that they're in, that they're going to find themselves in. And yet he says, David, no matter how bad this gets, man, I'm with you. We are brothers. Committed. No matter how bad or difficult or tough it gets. Life wasn't going to always be easy for these friends. And not only does Jonathan make a covenant with David, but it says that he gives him his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. You know what Jonathan just demonstrated in that very moment? He just demonstrated humility and an acknowledgement that David was going to be the next king of Israel. It would have been difficult because guess what? Barring anything happening to Saul, you know who's next in line for king? Jonathan. And so Jonathan to hand over his belt and his robe and his bow and his sword. He is demonstrating, I know that you're God's next king here in Israel. And I got to imagine how difficult that would have been for Jonathan because at this point, hey, dad's been king for a little while. I'm sure he's got ideas about what it would be like to be king. I'm sure he's kind of making some plans loosely. Hey, when I'm king, when I'm the guy in charge, God's saying, Jonathan, I'm sorry, but that's the guy. David's the guy. To have him to pull off the robe and to pull out the sword and to give him all of that. I would imagine that would have been really difficult and hard to do in that moment. And yet, Jonathan sees God's plans as bigger than his own. And there's this idea that I think is perplexing so many within culture and society today, and even in the church, that if we could get our minds wrapped around this idea, you would really be able to walk in some freedom. Does anybody want freedom today? Freedom from fear, anxiety, depression? I truly believe this would be a great help to you if that's you. Is that we need to view God as the main character of the story. That what's happening in the cosmos today, what's happening in your life right now, that God is the main character. And that you've been called to play a supporting role. And if you saw yourself as not the point or the main point, how that might liberate you from difficulty and conflict and pain and suffering. And when those things enter in and you realize that life's not all about your happiness, but that it's actually to glorify God, you can experience suffering in a different way. You can experience trial in a different way. You can experience hardship in a different way. Why? Because you're not the point. And that you actually have the ability to display God's glory through whatever difficulty you're facing. And so, Jonathan getting that blow to find out, hey, you're not the king? How can he handle that? He's not the main point. Okay, God, however you want to use me, however you want to work through this circumstance, I trust you with it. And I want to see you glorified through it. It's not necessarily about me and my plan and my story, but it's about God's story. And however, we see David continually demonstrate humility in knowing that he's going to be the next king. Yet he still, for a time, he says, I got to be obedient to God. And Saul is still the one in command. And Saul puts him in a place of military prowess. And David begins seeing victory. He begins seeing God's blessing. And in that creates a dilemma. Because guess what? Saul is not living. Saul wants to be the main character. He doesn't want to play the supporting role. And in that, when you become the main character and the main point, anybody that begins to threaten you being the main point, right? Every time they have success, you can't celebrate. Why? Because they're threatening the plot. Saul saw David as threatening the plot. And so look what happens. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Remember, this is the song. They're writing songs about this. Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. What did Saul just hear? When that song's getting blared all over the radio, right? It's the next big thing that's constantly being played. Every time you turn on the radio, right? It's like that. Those types of songs. What Saul was hearing was that David was bigger and a more critical role, which drove Saul mad. And it says in verse 9 that from that day on, Saul kept his eye on David. Everywhere David was going, Saul was trying to keep an eye on it, making sure he could keep things at bay. But he could not handle hearing the song of Saul struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Every time that song came on the radio, he had to turn it off. As it was rising on the charts, it enraged Saul. So much so, check this out. Starting in verse 10. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. It's an interesting game of darts. But David evaded him twice. Now, David's going about his every day, right? He's playing the harp like he normally does. And in this time, as he's playing the harp, he has no idea this great harboring of feelings that Saul has towards him. Right? He's like, yeah, I'm just this being obedient to God and being faithful to God, and yet it is brewing an enemy towards him. And it says that Saul hurls the spear at David in an attempt to kill him, and yet David survived twice. Here's my thing. If you try to throw a spear at me while I'm preaching, we are going to communally love you from a distance, right? We're just not going to invite that opportunity again. And so I'm thinking to myself, David, twice? Really? Like, why did you go back into that situation? And David, again, is demonstrating more humility to trust God's plans. And what we'll see as this story goes on is that this struggle that Saul has towards David is going to continue on for about a decade. For about 10 more years. Can you imagine? Like, hey, I don't know. Anybody got a difficulty in your work situation? No? Everybody's work is just awesome? You just love your boss so much? You write them notes? Thank you for being an amazing boss? I doubt it. I'm sure many of you would say, hey, I can't stand my boss sometimes. Any of y'all ever have a boss try to kill you by playing darts? No, my guess is no. Right? And if the answer is yes, we got some law enforcement in the room. Let's meet with them afterwards. We'll get you taken care of and protected. But this struggle goes on for a decade. And you may have a struggle going on, and it may feel like an eternity. But you're just waiting for God to come through for you in a way that would just alleviate stress and anxiety and fear. You're just wondering, why is God? Can you imagine for a decade this guy's on a witch hunt for David? Can you imagine that David would probably be wondering, hey, God, when are you going to show up for me? And yet that decade was needed. The decade was needed because God was using that time and the struggle to prepare David to be king. And I believe, with all my heart, I believe that all struggles help better prepare you for the mission of God, and that God does not waste time and he does not waste struggle. I pray you just believe that in your soul this morning. I see so many of our seniors at this church. I see them walking in freedom, just decades of being able to see how God came through for them, or how they saw God take difficulty and how he used it. We do our Tuesday morning Bible study, and I've always enjoyed that time because I get to see people that walked a lot of life, have seen a lot of things, experienced a lot of things, and yet have found God to be faithful. And I know that people's lives aren't always easy. And to see elderly folk praising God for his goodness, that gives me great hope. It gives me great hope. Just yesterday I was doing a funeral celebration of life service for one of our faithful members, Judy Engelman, who been here for nearly 4 decades. Multiple phone calls with her over the few years I've been here. And she had so many hardships befall her life. One of the largest hardships, losing a son. And yet, talking to her and having her tell me about the goodness of God and the joy that she had. How she can see how God has worked over the life. I mean, that's just testimony. That's faithfulness. That's why we do these stories, testimony videos. Because we truly believe, we truly believe that testimonies are not just a story to be told, but is a display of God's working to be seen. How God can work in difficult and hard times. And I hope and I pray that it gives you confidence that you see God's faithfulness in the lives of people. And it's easier to talk about than walk through it. But God's plans are always good, and we must be patient to obey God even when life's hard. And I so desperately want us to be a people who found the beauty in living in obedience to King Jesus. He is a king that you don't have to earn your favor before him. So many roads, so many false gods tell us to do this, to do X, Y, and Z, and God will give you the desires of your heart. That God will bless you and give you favor because of what you can do for him. In the economy of the God of the Bible, Yahweh, that's not how he works. He would say your good deeds are nothing but filthy rags. That's not to say that good deeds are bad things to do. But if you're using them as bartering chips with God, God would say, that's not the currency that I offer. That's not the currency that I accept. That's not how God receives love, not through your ability to do good things, but through a faithful heart. Through a faithful heart, to trust and believe that God is enough, that Jesus is enough. That's how God gets glorified through your life, through your belief and faith in him. The Bible would tell us that it is impossible to please God without faith. So I want us to be a faithful covenant community who obeys the heart of God. If you're here and you say, I don't know God, it might be your first time in church or the first time someone's ever presented you about the story of God in the world. If you want to know God, he's made himself visible in the person of Jesus, in the explanation of his word, that the word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's Jesus. And Jesus lived a life that you could never live. He lived a sinless life. We see this idea of sin as a thing that separates us from God for eternity. And yet, God, in his love for his creation, sends us Jesus. And Jesus becomes that payment for that sin that once alienated us from God, and it bridges us back to him, to have eternity with him, to have relationship with him. Jesus makes that possible through a relationship. To confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, you would have this relationship today, now and forever. I want to invite you into that if you never have. There's no magical prayer, no magical words, just the honest confession of your heart. Let me pray for us.